session, I'm going to try and cover four things. I'll introduce learner agency, typical sort of definition, explanation of what it is. I'll discuss some principles of developing learner agency, some best practices. In the third section, we'll talk about some potential issues related to using learner agency in the classroom. And depending on how much time we have, I'll sort of sum everything up at the end. All right. At this point, I'd like to say that my background is very much in practical teaching and teacher training. I love the theories and the research that people do, but I'm sure, like you, I don't have a huge amount of time to sort of stay up with what the research is saying. So everything I'm going to be sharing with you today, for the most part, is going to be based on my personal experience as a teacher, 25 years of teaching, as a teacher trainer, about 15, 16 years of teacher training experience, and as a writer, about 20 years of writing materials for English language teaching. And hopefully that sort of practical focus will be useful for you. At least that's my goal. So moving on then to the first part, which is introducing learner agency. And it's one of those terms that there's many possible definitions. If you search online or if you read some books, you'll find many different ways of saying what learner agency is. But I think the simplest option is just to say that it's about letting students make choices. Agency has that idea of having choice and being able to act. And in the terms of teaching English, it's about learning related choices, giving students opportunities to make some choices that are related to what they learn, how they learn, why they learn, when they learn, where they learn, those kinds of things. When we think about learner agency, there's two other terms that are quite similar, and these are learner autonomy and personalization. I think there is a difference, and I'm going to try and explain what that difference is right now. Learner autonomy, I think, it of course is about making choices sometimes, but I think it's more about giving students the opportunity to take some responsibility, some personal responsibility for what they learn and how they learn it. So rather than saying to the students, okay, learn this, we allow them opportunities to decide what they want to learn, how they want to learn it, and so on. And then in terms of personalization, of course, that's really just giving students the opportunity to connect what they've learned to their own lives. And ideally, we want to do that in ways that are not just make a connection, but are actually meaningful for students, personally meaningful. There is some research in terms of writing good quality materials for students, which says that when students are emotionally involved in what they're learning, they're more likely to enjoy the class, they're more likely to be motivated to study, they're more likely to actually learn what they're supposed to be learning. So I think if we're going to have personalization, we really want to make sure that it is meaningful for students, allows them to bring their own lives in ways that are actually meaningful rather than just simple or straightforward or on the surface. So we've got these three ideas, learner agency, learner autonomy, and personalization. And in an ideal world, I think we'd be able to bring these three things together to make our classes especially effective. So learner agency combining with learner autonomy, combining with personalization, and that sort of sweet spot in the middle where students are getting all three opportunities to develop some agency, to have some autonomy, and to personalize things. And that's where we really want to try and get our classes towards, because I think we give our students the most value. Okay. And based on my experience, 25 years in the classroom, 20 or so years of developing materials and so on, I think one of the reasons that learner agency, learner autonomy, and personalization are especially effective in helping our students to learn, in improving the quality of their learning, is that it can help students to develop something called a growth mindset. And I'll give you a quick definition here. In a growth mindset, people believe that their most basic abilities can be developed through dedication, through hard work. And brains and talent are important, but they're just the starting point for this journey towards learning. And this view, this mindset, can create a love of learning and a resilience, an ability to sort of bounce back from problems. And that this love of learning, this resilience, is essential for great accomplishment. Now, these are not my words. These are the words of a psychology professor called Carol Dweck, who works in the US at Stanford University and who developed this idea of a growth mindset. And she contrasts a growth mindset with something called a fixed mindset. And a fixed mindset is people feel that nothing can change. No matter what they do, their ability at something is fixed. It's not going to get better. And I'm sure we all have, in different aspects of our lives, we all have a growth mindset or a fixed mindset. But in terms of learning, I think it's quite important because people with a fixed mindset are going to say, well, they're going to say this. A student with a fixed mindset might say, I'm no good at English. I spent quite a lot of time working in some Asian countries, and I would often meet students who would say, I'm no good at English. English is too difficult for me. And I always try to overcome that and say, well, maybe you can't do it now, but you might be able to do it later. And that's what this growth mindset gives us. A student might say, I'm no good at English yet, but I'll get better. I've got 2 kids, and it's fantastic, wonderful, terrifying, scary, tiring. But one of the things that I think my wife and I have done quite well, is to develop a growth mindset in our children, particularly in terms of food. When I was growing up, my father was very fussy. He didn't like this food, he didn't like that food, and it made me that way as well when I was a child. And one of the things that I've tried to do with my sons is to develop this ability of liking food in the future. So my sons, when I ask them, do you like it? They don't say no, they say not yet. And that simple change from saying no to saying not yet has been incredibly powerful. My older son is 8 years old, and when it's his birthday, for example, and we say, what do you want to do? He might say, oh, I want to go to a Spanish restaurant because I really want to have a delicious paella. Or, oh, let's go to an Indian restaurant because I'm in the mood for a curry. Now, I don't think there are many 8-year-olds who would say that kind of thing. And I think this little story illustrates the power of this growth mindset. I can't do it yet, but I will be able to do it in the future. Now, there's another reason that I think learner autonomy, learner agency, and personalization are so effective at helping our students, is that it gives students an opportunity to become something called a reflective learner. Early in my teaching career, I came across a model called the conscious competence model. This is a psychological model. And this is actually one of the most important moments in my teaching career because it gave me something really powerful, simple but powerful, that helped me to understand what I was doing, how I was doing it, and so on. And the psychological model has these 4 stages that people go through. First stage is the so-called unconscious incompetence stage. To sum this up, it means you start learning something and you don't know what you're doing. And because you don't know what you're doing, you're clearly not going to be very good at it. So that's the incompetence. Unconscious, you don't know what you're doing. Incompetence, you're not very good at it. The second stage, after you start learning a little bit more, after you start doing a little bit more, you move on to the conscious incompetence stage. You know what you're doing now. You've had a little bit of experience, a little bit of practice, so you kind of have an idea of what to do, but you're still not very good at it. So you're conscious, you have an idea, but you're still incompetent. The third stage brings us to the conscious competence stage. You know what you're doing, and now you're pretty good at it. You still have to think about it, you still have to work at it, but you're doing a very good job now. And then the fourth stage, the final stage in the traditional model, is this stage of unconscious competence. You're so good at it that you no longer have to think about it. It's becoming automatic. In most areas of our lives, we can develop this ability. If you've been driving for a few years, you don't have to think about what you're doing when you drive. You can just drive very well. And you can drive so well, in fact, that you can, maybe you shouldn't, but you can use the telephone, you can have a conversation, you can think about what's going on, you can do all sorts of other things at the same time. If any of you have heard about this author called Malcolm Gladwell, let me write his name in the chat box for you. He's a really interesting author, based in actually originally from Toronto, I believe, and he writes these very interesting books about all sorts of different aspects of society. And he's the person who popularized the idea that to become an expert at something, you need 10,000 hours of practice, of focused practice. And I think this speaks to the idea of this unconscious competence. If you've done something for 10,000 hours, you're clearly going to be very good at it because you've had all that experience. And almost certainly you're going to have the ability to be good at it without thinking about it, without having to think what you're trying to do. And just a very quick example, again, a sort of personal example. My wife and I have been together now for 22 years. We haven't been married for 22 years, but we've been together as a couple for 22 years. And when I first met her, I fell madly in love with her, but I didn't know her. She's not from Canada or England. And so there was some cultural problems, and I didn't really know how to talk to her or how to make her understand my feelings. So at that stage, I was at the unconscious incompetence stage in terms of understanding what she was trying to say and in our relationship. After 20 years of being together, I'm very proud to say that I've now reached the conscious incompetence stage. I'm still terrible, but at least I kind of know what I'm doing. Maybe after another 22 years, I'll reach the conscious competence stage. We'll see. I can see some of you are talking about practice makes perfect or perfect practice makes perfect. Yes, absolutely. That's a very simple way to sort of sum up this model. But as I mentioned, I've done a lot of teacher training. I've done a lot of teaching. And over the years, I kind of felt something was missing. And I don't want to criticize people, but when I was doing teacher training, sometimes I would go into a class and it would be somebody who'd been teaching for 20, 30, 40 years. And I would be expecting that this person would be an amazing, amazing teacher, like fantastic, because clearly they were going to be at this unconscious competence stage. And for the most part, that was true. But there were certain teachers I met who I felt weren't as good as they could have been, weren't as good as they should have been, given how much experience they had. And I had this idea that perhaps these teachers were doing something that we call coasting. In English, coasting is the idea that when you cycle to the top of a hill, when you get to the top of the hill, you don't need to cycle anymore. You can just let gravity take you down. It's easy. You don't have to use the energy or the effort to go down the hill faster. And in some cases, it's safer, of course. But when it comes to your job, when it comes to your life, when you start coasting, it means you're no longer putting in the effort. You're no longer putting in the energy to do things at a really high level. And I found that quite a few people, of teachers that I was working with, were perhaps coasting a little bit. They were clearly very, very good at what they were doing. They didn't have to think about it anymore. But they weren't perhaps pushing themselves to get better. They felt that they were good enough already. And I began to worry, was that something that I was doing? And I always want to push myself to get better. And so I kind of looked at this model again, and I tried to find a different way to think about it, a different way to imagine it. And I looked at these 4 stages of learning, and I realized that, we don't want to be incompetent. We want to be competent. So let's get rid of those first 2 stages. And then let's add something. And the add something is reflection. I consciously pushed myself back to the conscious competence stage where I was thinking about what I was doing because I wanted to get better. And I felt when I was at the unconscious competence stage, I wasn't thinking about what I was doing anymore. So I added in this sort of cycle of reflection. You get to conscious competence, you get to unconscious competence, you reflect on it, and you push yourself back into that stage. So you're trying to learn continuously while you're doing your job. And I have found this to be very, very effective for me as a teacher, but it's something that I've tried to work with my students as well to help them develop this ability to reflect on their own learning. And it's not easy. Some people kind of resist this. They think they know what they're doing. But if you ask certain questions, you can usually get people to admit that perhaps they could be doing something a little bit better. And often people get really excited about improving, about getting better at what they do. So I think that this revised competencies model is something that I found very, very useful, because if we bring it back to learner agency in itself often leads students to reflect on what they're learning. And in my experience, when people reflect, they become better at learning. They simply become better at what they're doing. And I hope this is quite a powerful way to think about it. So, quick question in the chat box, please. I'm curious. I can't ask you to raise your hands, but I can ask you in the chat box. How many of you were familiar with the model already? Not this one yet, Emily. Sorry. So this idea of a growth mindset. How many of you had learned about the growth mindset or heard about the growth mindset before? Just type in yes or me, something like that. So just quickly looking, it seems that many of you, the answer was yes. For some of you, no, and that's great. Even if you've learned about this before, I do think this is a very powerful way to think about learning, and nice to have perhaps that that reminder. And if you hadn't learned about it before, I would encourage you to review it. I found this to be incredibly powerful in my own life. I mean, not as a teacher, just as a human. This sense that yes, I can get better, and you can actually develop that ability, that mindset. And how about the conscious competency model? Have any of you been familiar with this before? Interesting. With the growth mindset, there was probably more yeses than nos, and with the conscious competency model, perhaps slightly more nos than yeses. But great. Again, I think if you've heard about it before, the reminder never hurts. And if you haven't heard about it before, again, I hope this will be useful, something that you can look into. Yeah, I found it quite useful myself. So let's move on to the second part of the talk, and this is where we'll try to spend the most time today, and that's exploring principles and best practices related to learner agency. And I'll start by sharing with you a number of different approaches or methods to teaching a foreign language. So we've got active learning, the flipped classroom, the communicative approach, the famous or infamous grammar translation method, CLIL, content language integrated learning, which is very big these days, demand high teaching, learner agency, of course, what we're discussing today, and the lexical approach. And I'm going to ask you please to say which one of these is the odd one out. And I'm being deliberately unclear about what it means by the odd one out. Choose your answer, please. Which one is not the same as the others? So a few people saying the flipped classroom, CLIL, demand high teaching, learner agency, the lexical approach. But I think the grammar translation method is far and away the favorite for being the odd one out. And let's decide. You were right if you chose the grammar translation method. Congratulations. You win today's prize, which is that I won't tell you the really bad joke at the end of the session. All right. And I think the reason that this is the odd one out, and sorry, before I go on, you could make an argument that any of them is the odd one out, that any of them could be different from the others. But for me, the grammar translation method is an inflexible approach to teaching. And the name kind of tells you what to do. You've got to have grammar, and you've got to do translation. And if you don't have grammar and you don't have translation, you're doing it wrong. It's not the grammar translation method. But the other approaches to teaching, learner agency and all of the others, are very broad ideas. They can accommodate a very wide variety of ways of implementing demand high teaching or CLIL or flipped classroom or learner agency and so on. And that's what makes them more similar to each other than the grammar translation method, which really does have to have grammar and have to have translation. And this is important for us, I think, because when it comes to implementing learner agency, there's no right way to do it. We have a huge amount of flexibility because as long as you're giving students some agency, you're doing it right. So I think as a teacher, I like those ways of teaching that have a lot of flexibility for me, because my classroom situation changes every single day. When I go into the classroom, it's different because there's a different number of students, or somebody's absent who I was relying on. The person who always answers the questions is not here, so things are a little bit different today. And I think it's really helpful for us as teachers to have that flexibility built in. And so when we think about learner agency, almost any activity could help develop learner agency if you keep this idea in mind. All right? And I'm not saying that any of these methods is wrong. I mean, grammar translation has, I can see a comment that it has been very successful. Yes, of course. It's not that there's anything bad about it. In certain situations, it is an effective approach. But we're talking today about learner agency, and let's try and move on to some ideas for how we can do that. Having said that anything's okay, which is not very helpful for you, anything's okay, go and do it. Let me try and give you some suggestions, some things that I have found to be very useful for developing learner agency in the classroom. One thing that I like to do is to offer strategies of value outside the classroom. Of course, they should be valuable inside the classroom as well, but I like to try and give my students suggestions and strategies that will benefit them outside the classroom, because then they can take agency and make choices that are effective, knowing that what they're learning in the classroom is going to benefit them outside the classroom. And for me, this is one of the big challenges of English language teaching, or to be honest, any language teaching. There's kind of a paradox. If I'm a fantastic teacher with a group of students, and I give them everything that they understand, so that when they're in my classroom, they understand perfectly. There's a 100% understanding, comprehension is up, and that's fantastic. And the students will think, what a great teacher, I understand everything, I'm learning a lot. But the reality is that when they get outside the classroom, they're not going to meet people who are trying perfectly to be able to be understandable. They're going to meet people who don't care whether this person understands them or not. They're going to meet people who are busy, who don't have time to take the time to help people understand. So I think it's valuable for us as teachers to always remember that what we're teaching in the classroom needs to go outside the classroom and be of value to students. Another suggestion is to set tasks that have personalization built in, the things that students want to talk about and connect to their own lives. Let's try and build those into the tasks so that it's not just something that's divorced from students' own lives, it's something that students can connect to what they're learning. A third suggestion, I think it's very helpful to give students opportunities to set personal aims or goals, and to measure things, to measure the values of what they're learning, to measure the values that they have, to measure the values that they want from this particular exercise. I'll give you some examples that will make these things clearer in a minute. I think it's also very helpful when we're giving students agencies to provide resources to help students do more. It doesn't have to be detailed resources. I mean, often the best resource is simply to say, go and Google something or search for it online. But if we give students that opportunity, I think it can be valuable. And the final suggestion that I'm going to talk about today is to give students opportunities to make choices. This is our original definition for learner agency. And of course, there are many, many more things that we could say, but these 5 are ones that I think have been most useful for me to provide opportunities for agency. And I always want to sort of help people remember things, so I've given you this little acronym of SPARK for strategies, personalization, aims, resources, and choices. You'll notice that I didn't reverse the order because that would have been a slightly less easy acronym. So let's have a look at these now. We've got some suggestions for how to implement learner agency. And let me just talk you through some examples from some of the National Geographic Learning titles. These are all books that I wrote or co-wrote with somebody else. I didn't feel comfortable bringing up other authors' work on the screen, but my work I don't mind explaining because I know what I had in mind when I was doing it. So this example comes from World English, and at the end of every lesson within each unit, there is this goal check section. And the goal check section, of course, is trying to give students an opportunity to reflect on what they've learned. So there's already reflection built in. And this activity has a sort of a step-by-step opportunity, a step-by-step approach. In step one, it asks students to choose the place you live now, or a place you've lived before, or a place you would like to live in the future. So of course, we've got choices built in here. And look at step two, there's this checklist. Prepare to write the description, use the checklist. And the checklist is very, very simple. Make some notes, decide what information, decide the best order, and then review the guide to writing descriptive language, which is earlier on the page. But for me, this simple checklist is actually a strategy. It's a strategy that allows students to think how best to write something. When we talk about writing, we often talk about the writing process or process writing. And a step-by-step approach with checkboxes is actually a little strategy that students could use. They don't have to, but it can be an effective way to help them to write more effectively. And then, of course, everything is personalization because it's about you, the place you live now, the place you have lived before, a place you would like to live in the future. So what we've got here is an exercise that gives students these three ways to give them agency. They've got opportunities to make choices, personalization is built in, and there's a strategy of value outside the classroom. Here's another example from World English. I'm going to go through fairly quickly on this one because it's actually the same. We've got opportunities for choices because students are asked to think about a social situation that might be difficult, and that's their decision about what social situation might be difficult. There's personalization because students are being asked to think about situations that they have experienced. And then there's a strategy. In this communication skill box, there's a strategy sort of built in. It says that we often use imperative clauses when there's an emergency. Cover your head, move to a safe area, get out of here now. But in normal situations which are not emergencies, that language, the use of an imperative, is very, very strong. So we might want to soften it with a phrase like, it's a good idea to, or you might want to. And this gives students this strategy for effective communication. Moving on now, there's some examples from a book called Pathways. And what we've got here is an activity that is the final task in a unit. And we're asking students to give what's called an elevator pitch. An elevator pitch is a presentation that's designed to persuade somebody to invest in your product, to accept your idea, to give you an opportunity. And it's called an elevator pitch because the idea is that you deliver it in the time it takes the elevator to go up or down, because you get into the elevator and your boss is there and you've got 30 seconds or 60 seconds with her, and therefore you use this opportunity to pitch your idea. So I think in and of itself this is quite a useful task because it's the kind of thing that's actually people might do in the real world. Many of our students won't be asked to stand up on a stage and deliver a presentation to hundreds of people, but they might well have an opportunity to speak to somebody for a short time, 30 or 60 seconds, and have to make a sort of persuasive pitch. So in and of itself, I think this is quite useful. And so there's obviously choices here, but students have to decide. They have to set their own goals. So I think this activity gives them opportunities to make choices and also allow them to set aims and to measure the value of what they're giving. Another example from Pathways. At the end of each unit, there's this reflection section. Students have an opportunity to think about what they've learned, to write some sentences that describe how they feel. And there's a list of vocabulary, and I'm not sure if you can see it very clearly, but some of the words have AWL next to them. That stands for Academic Word List. So there's a little resource here to give students an opportunity to go away and study the words that they think are useful. So setting aims and values and a resource to help students do more. A book called 21st Century Communication, Listening, Speaking, and Critical Thinking. An activity here that asks students to think about some problems It could be global problems, it could be local problems, it could even be personal problems that they would like to solve, and then to think about how more data, more information would help them to solve or understand those problems. And what we can say here is that this activity certainly opportunities for students to make choices. There's personalization built in because it's problems that students are thinking about and how it would help them. And then students are setting aims because they're thinking how they could solve this problem, what problem is. One more example from the same book, 21st Century Communication, an activity that gets students to personalize. Question 2, for example, if you could choose several foods to feast on, which ones would you choose? This is obviously quite a high-level book because the vocabulary is quite challenging. Question 3, think of a thriving business such as a restaurant that you know. What are some reasons it is doing so well? So lots of choices there. And then this little section at the bottom, the Learn More section. Students are just about to watch a video, a very, very interesting TED Talk, in fact, by a chef who is really trying to promote the farm to table movement. The idea that you want food to be as fresh as possible, to have used as few resources as possible. And he talks about this very unusual fish farm in Spain. Now, it may be that students are not particularly interested, but if they are, we've given them this opportunity, this resource to learn more. So we've got personalization built in, and then resources for students to do more. And then a final example, and this is from some unpublished material that I'm working on right now, in fact, for National Geographic Learning. And this may never get published, but this is what I've got so far. It's an activity that asks students to work together to create an infographic, and it's related to creativity. If you're not very familiar with this term infographic, here's a quick example. An infographic is a diagram or an illustration that has some text on it. So it's a kind of combination of picture and text. And the activity asks students, first of all, to look at some examples of infographics that are in this book, and then to find some examples online. So this is all about giving them a resource to keep going. It asks them to think about what the infographic should include. So they're going to be making choices there. It's personalization. And it's all about goals and aims because they have to come up with what they think their infographic should include. So there's quite a few things going on here. And when I was writing this, I'm in the back of my mind, I've got those ideas. How much agency can I give students here? So these suggestions, I hope will be useful for you when you're judging activities in textbooks. But sometimes, of course, you want to come up with your own ideas for promoting agency or developing agency in your classroom. And so I'm going to give you 3 suggestions, 3 principles for doing that. And the 3 are quite simple. The first one is to keep the task as accessible as possible. The second one is to ensure the task has intrinsic interest. And the third one is to try and include agency in multiple ways. And again, a little helpful acronym, you can aim to do these 3 things: accessibility, interest, and multiplicity, doing it in multiple ways. So if we want to keep the task as accessible as possible, the task, whatever you're giving students, shouldn't be the challenge itself. The task should be an opportunity to give students a chance to develop agency. So try to avoid very difficult tasks that require students to really do a lot of thinking and work just to understand the task or to do the task. You want them to get to that agency quite quickly because that's what's motivating, that's what's engaging, that's what's giving the students the opportunities for learning. And I think if we keep in mind the lowest student in the class or the weakest student in the class, and I'm not trying to be negative, every class, even if everybody's supposed to be at B1 or B2 or whatever, every student, of course, is at a slightly different level. And I think it can be very helpful to keep this idea in mind of people who are struggling a little bit more, who are less experienced. A quick tip here is to use language below your student's level to explain what the task involves. So if you are teaching a B1 class, maybe try and use words that are mostly A2, because that will make it easy for students to understand, and therefore the agency will come out more. And I can see some of you giving some very good suggestions for helping this concept checking questions, yes, no questions, and so on, of course. And I think we also want to ensure that the task has what's called intrinsic interest. Students are actually genuinely interested in it. There are certain tasks that have extrinsic interest, means we've told you that this is interesting, or we've told you to be interested. Or students are interested because they think it will help them in the future for their job or whatever. But if we can make sure the task itself is genuinely interesting, that can be very valuable. Because tasks that offer agency are motivating, but only if the task itself is not boring. And I think we need to be a little bit careful. Even tasks that are intrinsically interesting can become boring if the topic is one that's overused. A lot of textbooks, for example, have a unit on the environment or on technology, and those are interesting topics. But if students have used 5 different books with 5 different units on 5 different aspects of the environment, perhaps they don't necessarily want to talk about or learn about the environment anymore. A quick tip: one thing I found is quite useful is to ask questions about students' lives. Now, I'm not generally somebody who particularly wants to know about my students' lives, because I think they're there themselves, and I'm maybe an introvert who's not that open to asking questions. But I've learned that when I ask questions about what students find interesting, that gives me valuable insights to come up with ideas that can be helpful for students. I can see in the comments that some of you are suggesting that perhaps we want to challenge students when we're giving classroom instructions, and there's certainly value for that. This idea of roughly tuned and finely tuned input, where if you give students instructions that are just above their level, you can help them to come up. And in certain cases, that's absolutely valuable. But in terms of learner agency or certain tasks, if you really want to give students an opportunity to develop learner agency, don't make the task so difficult that the agency becomes something that happens right at the end. Try to make the task simpler so that the agency can come right from the beginning, because then you get the most value from it. And I'm curious now, we talked about topics that have intrinsic interest or tasks that have intrinsic interest. In the chat box, does anybody have some suggestions for topics or tasks that are intrinsically interesting? I'd love to see the ideas that you have. Some excellent ideas. Social media, social networking seems to come up a lot, and yes, of course, I mean that's something that people spend a lot of their time doing. Music, sport, food, anything that everybody enjoys. Maybe sport is not right, but certainly food. I mean, everybody eats. Travel, everybody travels. In many situations, people have traveled in order to come to the class, whether it's traveling across town or traveling across the world. So these are some excellent ideas. And the final suggestion is to include agency in multiple ways. And I think at a minimum, we want to be getting into personalization and choices. Those are the sort of the backbone or the foundation of learner agency. And I think personally that providing strategies that are broadly valuable can be highly useful and highly motivating for students. That's something that I've tried to do throughout my teaching career, is to give students something that they can take away and not just use in the classroom. And that's certainly something that I've found to be valuable. And I've talked about strategies quite a lot, but I thought it might be helpful to give you a little suggestion, a strategy, if you like, for coming up with strategies. When I'm giving a strategy to my students, I like to remember this rule C. A strategy needs to be simple, easy to understand, easy to use. It needs to be effective. If I'm giving students a strategy, it needs to actually work. It needs to help them. And it needs to be actionable, by which I mean something that students can do in any situation if they've got no time to prepare, if they've just got this situation, this problem, or whatever, they can do it. A very simple suggestion, a very simple example, perhaps. Um, in English, if I say, "So you aren't coming," and I'm asking this negative question, if people say no, that means they aren't coming. But in other cultures, if I say, "So you aren't coming," no, that means no, I'm not coming, means I am coming. And there's a real potential for confusion there. So one of the strategies that I give my students in answering these negative questions is to not say yes or no, but to give a full sentence. So you aren't coming? No, I'm not coming. Or yes, I'm not coming. And even if yes, I'm not coming sounds strange to me as a native speaker of English, I will understand the student's idea. And that simple strategy of answering with a full sentence is very, very simple. I mean, effective? Absolutely, because people will understand immediately. Is it actionable? Yeah, of course, because all you have to do is just give a longer answer, and you can do that in any situation. So here's an example of C. Strategy should be simple and effective and actionable. And I know sometimes as teachers we don't want to give our students very, very clear advice about doing this or doing this because we feel that we're taking away their agency. And I can understand that point of view, but I think that a strategy is something that students can use again and again and again, and it gives them this great feeling of agency because it's so useful in so many different situations. We've talked a lot about some ideas for developing agency, and what I'd like to do is show you a video from one of the series that we've looked at already, which is this World English book. So please watch this video, and then we'll talk about it a little bit.
People often ask me this question: where are you from? It's a difficult question. Am I from Ghana? My parents live there, but I do not. Am I from the United Kingdom? I was born there, and I have a UK passport, but I didn't live there long. Am I from the US? I lived in Boston for 12 years, and New York for 6, and I have an American passport. But I do not live in the US. Am I from Portugal? I live in Lisbon, but I am not Portuguese. So the question, where are you from, is very difficult to answer. Maybe a better question is, where are you a local? It's better because it's about me, a person, and not about a country or a passport. For example, I am a local in Accra, where my parents live. I go there every year with my twin sister, and we spend time with our mother in her garden. I am local in New York, where my best friends live. I visit the city at least twice a year. I am also local in Rome and Berlin, where I lived for 3 years each. I am a local in Lisbon, where I live now. What makes these places local for me? It is the people I love who live there.
I was looking at the chat while we were watching that video, and I could see some of you had no sound. I'm really sorry about that. Some of you were saying that the bandwidth was too heavy. Again, sorry about that. Quickly sum up what we saw. This was a video by a TED speaker, although it wasn't a TED talk itself, and she was saying the question, where are you from, is a difficult question to answer for her. And I think for many of us these days in this sort of global world we live in. And she was saying that she doesn't like to answer where she's from. She likes to answer where she feels like a local, a person who lives in that area. And I think it might be an interesting question for us to answer. Where do we feel local rather than where are we from? If you saw the original, I'm from the UK and Canada. I have two passports because my father is Canadian, my mother is British. But if I think about where I am a local, um, I'm a local in England and in Toronto. Um, I I grew up in Britain, and I think of myself as British. Um, uh, I'm not sure if I should think of myself as European anymore with Brexit going on, but when I go to Scotland or Wales or Northern Ireland, I don't feel local because the culture is slightly different. It's fantastic culture. I love those countries, but I don't feel a local there because the accent is different. The culture is slightly different. And I've lived in Toronto for 17 years now. I love it. It's a fantastic city. Um, but if I go outside Toronto, even a little way outside, I no longer feel like a local because I didn't grow up in Canada. I didn't have those shared experiences that other people have. And because it's not a city I know well, I no longer feel like a local. And that's kind of interesting that I feel like a local from one country and only one city. I've lived in other cities like New York and Tokyo, and when I was there, I would certainly have said I was a local. So it's kind of interesting. In the chat, how about you guys, please? Where are you a local from? Some very interesting answers coming in. I particularly like Northwest Ohio and Southeast Ohio, and then Paris. I'm not sure what's wrong with Northeast Ohio or Southwest Ohio, but clearly something's wrong with that area. So um, anyway, let's move on now to the final. Sorry, not the final. The third part, which is where we discuss some of the issues with learner agency. There are benefits, and I hope I've shown you some of those benefits and shown you some ways to develop agency in your classroom. But there may seem to be some potential drawbacks. Luckily, I think there are solutions, simple solutions that we can adopt that will help us minimize each of these disadvantages. One possible issue is that, generally speaking, teachers are expected to know what is best for students. We're supposed to be the person who gives students what they need. And if we give our students agency, perhaps it feels like we're not sure what is best for them. Um, so what can we do about this? Well, I think if we combat this perception, um, I think it helps to be very explicit about what you're doing and why you're doing it. So when you give students opportunities for agency, I think it's good to say, look, I'm doing this to give you agency. I'm giving you the opportunities to make your own choices. I'm giving you these strategies that will help you. I'm giving you resources to learn more about something. And for what it's worth, being explicit about what you're doing and why you're doing it, I have found to be a highly effective teaching strategy because students understand that you've got an idea in mind that gives them a benefit. And they are almost always willing to come along with you when they know that you have a plan. I've worked with some very, very effective teachers who didn't like to do this. And yet sometimes students would not be willing to come along because they weren't sure that it was going to be of value to them. So be explicit. Tell students what you're doing and why. Another possible situation is that often in a classroom, the teacher is expected to be the focal point. The teacher is the one who's supposed to give students everything they need. And if you give students agency, it kind of looks like you're expecting them to do your job for you. And therefore, you're no longer the focal point, the focus of the lesson. So what can we do about this? Well, in the flipped classroom, if you've ever tried to use the flipped classroom, there's this idea of no longer being a sage on the stage, but instead being a guide on the side. A sage on the stage, sage, as I'm sure most of you know, is a word meaning a person who has a lot of wisdom and knowledge. And on the stage refers to the idea that teachers are at the front of the classroom. They may not literally be on a raised platform or stage, but the idea is that everything focuses on. There's an audience, the students, they're looking towards the front of the room, the stage. And that's a valuable role sometimes. The person who has more knowledge, who's controlling the class. Because generally speaking, the teacher does have more knowledge than students, and it's often good for the class to sort of like flow through the teacher. But the suggestion for learner agency and for flipped classrooms is that instead of being this sage on the stage, you become a guide on the side. You're there to facilitate the learning, to help students understand ways to do things and the value of doing things in these ways. And I think if we do that in a situation where we're giving students agency, I think it's valuable. Students can see that you're no longer the sage on the stage. You're no longer giving them everything. You're expecting them to give you a lot, but you're there whenever they need you. You're there to offer suggestions, to guide, to facilitate. So that can be a valuable way to overcome this potential disadvantage. A challenge here is that it's sometimes difficult to come up with authentic, relevant content and up-to-date content and tasks. And so students may find the opportunities unexciting. What can we do about this? Well, I've already sort of suggested that we can monitor our students in different ways. We can monitor to learn what their interests are so that we can choose those topics that are particularly interesting. And we can monitor to gauge the mood of the classroom, the atmosphere. If you feel that students are not particularly excited or interested, then move on. Be very clear. Look, I can feel that you're not very happy about this. Let's move on. Or, even better, you give students agency. You can say, look, it looks like you're not happy. How would you like to change this activity? What would you like to do differently? So you've given students agency over what they're doing, and I think this is quite valuable. Going back to this idea of coming up with motivating, interesting content, the video we just saw was not a TED Talk. It was developed from a TED Talk by this wonderful woman, and because NGL has a very close relationship with TED, we were able to get that video re-recorded with simpler language to help our students. Obviously, that's not something that most teachers are going to be able to do, right? But technology makes life very interesting for us. We've got this video program called VLC. I've put that in the chat. And VLC has this wonderful feature, which is that it allows you to slow down video. And video is often very engaging, very motivating. But if it's too fast, students will find it very challenging. So by using something like VLC, you can actually just slow down the video and make it much more accessible to students, much more interesting. And when we slow down audio, it doesn't sound like this, which is not natural. It actually just slows it down in a way that sounds very natural. So a very useful little trick if you want to. And then the final possible issue, and I think this is perhaps the most challenging one for us as teachers, is what to do when agency makes the class go in directions that are unexpected and unplanned. It can be very challenging for us as teachers to feel that the class is no longer in our control, and you just don't know which way it's going to go, what's going to happen. And yes, that can be scary, but as you do this more, you move to that unconscious competence stage, and you will develop the ability to handle any direction. And I think the fantastic thing is that when we do this, the lessons become more engaging, they become more motivating, and they're full of emergent language. Emergent language is what comes up naturally, and that's the kind of stuff that students are likely to need because it's the stuff that they're trying to come up with. And it's their class, right? I mean, you're teaching the class for the students, not for yourself. So I think it's fine that students have a say in this direction. I wasn't sure how much time we would have in this session. Sometimes it goes quite quickly, sometimes less quickly. So I put in this fourth section to sum up everything we've talked about, but it really is just a summing up. I'm not going to say anything different. So I'm going to skip through these slides very quickly. You'll have the opportunity to download the PDF so you can have a look at these if you want to. But there's one final thing I'd like to share with you. And it's this one. There's one thing we didn't cover yet, which is what should you do next? I hope I've given you a little bit of an overview of what agency is, of how to implement it or develop it in the classroom. But what should you do next? And my answer is very simple. It's up to you, because this is about agency, and I think it makes sense that I give you some agency right now. And that's it. Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Thank you to everyone for attending. I really appreciate your time. Thank you to National Geographic Learning for the opportunity, and thank you especially to Emily and the rest of the NGL team for helping to make this a very successful, at least in my opinion, a very successful event. So thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Christian. It was a wonderful webinar, super practical, and I hope everyone listening really got some practical tips about learner agency and promoting that in your classroom that you can take to try out. So great. I see some questions coming in about the certificate. We will be sending that along to you after the session. Give us about 3 business days, but we will email that to you. And if you have any questions, you can always contact us at ngl.webinars@cengage.com. We'll also be including that in that email links to the recording as well as the download of these slides for you, a PDF version of those. Great. So thanks everyone for joining. I do just have a few quick announcements to end with here and a little more information about an exciting initiative that we're doing in this month of October. So if you could stay on for a second, that would be wonderful. First off, many of the examples used today were from World English, the 3rd edition, which Christian is an author for. To find out a little bit more about it, you can visit the website here, but we'll be including information about World English in the follow-up email to you as well. And then I did want to tell you all about Learning Moments, which is a really exciting initiative. We're asking teachers of English all around the world to send in photos of your everyday life. It's a huge part of the mission of what we do is bringing the real world to the classroom. So we'd love you to take some photos of everyday life around you and tell us how you'd use it actually in the classroom. You have a little section to write about it and then send it in to us, and we will actually be featuring some of these photos on the InFocus blog, on our social media channel, on our website, and following up with you. So it'd be great to just connect teachers around the world in this initiative. You can learn more by scanning the QR code below, or I'll include the URL here, Learning Moments. And we'll actually be doing a Facebook Live session that will be hosted by Ruben Salgado on October 15th on our Facebook page. If you're not following us, the next slide will show you the link to that. And that will just include some tips for taking amazing photos. So we'd love for you to take part. I'll include some information in the follow-up email about that as well too. Just wanted to make sure you all knew. Great. Again, so thank you for joining us. I'm so happy you could be here today. We will be doing another session tonight if you missed any of this or want to join, and look out for the recording. I'm going to send you all to a follow-up survey now just to give us your feedback. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great rest of your morning, afternoon, or evening. Bye. Thanks, Christian.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks, everyone.
Oh, and just a quick note, I see a question about the time. It's at 3 p.m. Boston time. We do have a converter on our website if you'd like to see what time that is where you are.